Greetings all, my name is Ann Ghostfair and I serve as SNU-Tulsa's campus director and have done so since 2002. Welcome to this recorded session of SNU's March Mindfulness. I have to admit I come to you kicking and screaming somewhat and with some reservations. While I believe that my story is unique and my life is very blessed and I'm a God's child, I do not believe that I am remarkable in any way, and I do not believe that my lived experiences have any more value than yours. So the whole point of this offering is for you to practice your reflective practitioner skills and to explore some of your lived experiences. I've been asked to share my story by Dr. Crusoe, and I'm happy and honored to oblige. I can only hope and pray that it will speak to you in some small way. There will be times during this recording where I'll ask you to stop and reflect. I'll ask you to honestly ponder the questions provided and to be blatantly honest with yourself as you answer. What you do during this time is completely up to you. The choices are completely in your power. The time that you take is completely up to you, and the answers will only be known by you. So be honest. You may be thinking, and as I has admittedly done, who would want to hear about an ILE subject from an old white woman? In the first place, I've got to say, I don't know how I got to be 66 years old. A minute ago, I was 36. A second ago, I was 49. So what happened here? Well, don't worry, it'll happen to you too, if it hasn't already, and you will love what learning from life brings you. Sometimes you won't love it, but most of the time you will. I was born of English, French, and Scottish ancestors, and I've always identified as heterosexual female. I can only approach life within these descriptors, and you can only approach life from your personal lenses as well. However, reflective practice has taught me that I have been afforded a life that was never separated from the Holy Trinity and heavily influenced by my parents, grandparents, and other servant leaders who determined that I would respect and value all people. It was instilled in me from birth that while I was born as an Anglo-American daughter of an Episcopal priest and a journalist, I would not be a part of disrespect or hate toward anyone and was taught to actively work toward inclusion and equity. Thus, while inclusion and equity takes on many, many forms, this offering will focus mainly on racism. Thus begins my life in thirds. Thank you for joining me on this adventure. The first third, 7 years old. I was 7 years old and in second grade at Hayes Elementary School in Ada, Oklahoma, when President Kennedy was assassinated. Although it's been almost 60 years since, I remember the teachers crying, children crying, and all of us being sent home. The scene at home was the same, parents crying and relatives and friends calling and sharing shock and grief. At 7, I watched all of the television coverage and remember my mother telling her best friend she couldn't get me away from the TV. At 7, I lost innocence as I knew then what someone could do to my family's president, the president that we were so excited about at his election and whose speeches we discussed at dinner. I knew at 7 that the person who, in my mind, was going to make sure people who were born with darker skin colors than mine wouldn't have everything and every opportunity that white people had. They would have every opportunity. I remember repeatedly thinking, what would happen to the people that President Kennedy was helping? What would happen to us? What would happen to this country? I decided and pledged at 7 years old that I would be a part of President Kennedy's legacy, and I would not knowingly be a part of hate actions or words against people who happened to be born a different way than I. Did I always do it? Absolutely not. I remember a group of classmates unmercifully teasing another, And I still, to this day, feel very badly that I did nothing to stop it. I now reflect, why was a 7-year-old so concerned about people of color? Why was that 7-year-old impacted so strongly that she made a pledge to try and be different? Remember Dr. Dennis Williams in his great March Mindfulness presentation, how he talked about I-thou stories and I am stories? Let's practice those concepts at this point. Let's put on those and that's me too roles with this private individual exercise. I'll pose some questions, but feel free to ponder your own questions and to actively and honestly use self-reflection to see yourself. Reflect on these questions, then stop the recording and journal or honestly think about your answers. These questions are merely suggestions. You will have your own questions for yourself. Now think of your 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old or other foundational age you. What was your family's philosophy about people with different skin colors and ethnic backgrounds? What was the language in your home or at school during these formative years? What were your self-expectations? What did you believe? What were your beliefs different from your influencers, if they were? Do you remember standing up for a person of color or someone in a vulnerable situation? Do you remember watching as others teased or bullied a person perceived as less powerful? What advice would you give your younger self? Now stop the recording and join me after you've done. Welcome back and welcome to the second third of this adventure. Jumping ahead many years, this offering isn't in equal thirds, by the way. My thoughts travel to a time when I was able to make a strong yet very visible statement of my personal mission and life philosophy. You might relate to this in some way. I was in graduate school earning my master's in adult education. I was also in a very culturally infused program. That program, along with my doctoral program, were both immersed in cross-cultural, infused cultural, and multifaceted experiences. What a gift. While there were many, many times, one of these prevailing cultural immersion experiences was with this country's indigenous or native people. As I am married to a remarkable man named John, whose father was full-blooded Oglala Lakota and mother was Cherokee, this was a very familiar setting for me. While these experiences were not my own, they had profound effect on my life and on my choices, and they were many of my family's experiences. John's parents were both removed from their families at tender ages and sent away to boarding schools to be forced to assimilate into the predominant white culture and to be forced to leave their native cultures and language behind. As you may know from history, the boarding schools were often places of horrible abuse, and the children were not allowed to speak their native languages. If the children were heard speaking their native languages, they were sent to an official's office and had to kneel on broom handles for hours at a time, or other severe punishments to learn their lesson about not speaking English. One day, John's dad and a friend were quietly speaking Lakota, the nation many people call Sioux, and were caught. Taken to an official's office, John's dad, who was a young teen at the time, and his friend were beaten and told again to kneel on the broom handles. My father-in-law complied, but his friend refused. His friend was beaten to death in front of John's dad. Many years later, John's dad moved to Oklahoma, married a Cherokee girl, and together they had 3 children. They lived hard but happy lives for many years. Although John's parents died young from stress and traumas experienced as young people, they raised their children to meet violence with nonviolence and to always stand up for people who were being hurt or abused. Sadly, John's dad felt that he had to put his Lakota 2-worded last name, Ghost Bear together into one word. He did this because he was forced to assimilate into white culture, and he wanted to make a good living for his family. Horrendous atrocities such as these may leave you in shock and may leave you feeling extremely helpless. I can identify with those feelings. While I did not have these life experiences, I experienced great emotional responses and a yearning of great proportions. Then I realized that I could do something during my master's program that would be a very powerful statement. I asked John and his family's permission to separate our last name back to its original 2 words. That wish was granted and celebrated, so today, this old white woman bears a 2-worded Lakota name, Ghost Bear. I hope that it honors John's family. Now it's your turn. In the middle of your life so far, wherever that is, please take some time to think about where you were, what you were doing, and what some of your experiences were. What, like me, do you lament about and confess today? What were some of your strong feelings? What were some of your frustrations and times of feeling helpless? What were your responses to these times? Did you make any outward statements or actions during these times? Take an honest look at your life at that point and join me again after you're done. Welcome back to the last third of my life and a time that I hope will be meaningful for you. While this portion isn't specifically about racism, it's about a memorable lived experience that I promised God I would share. It had some powerful lessons that I'm still reflecting on to this day. Many of you had heard this story in its entirety or in its shortened version, so I apologize if you've heard it before. Feel free not to watch or listen to this section if you've heard about my husband John dying, yet God calling him back to life. This is difficult to talk about, but talk I must. In the winter of 2017, John was anemic and losing blood internally, yet tests were unable to find the blood loss source. Among a plethora of other problems, a blood clot was discovered, and Eliquis, a blood thinner, was incorrectly prescribed. Blood thinners shouldn't be prescribed to anemic people. One day, a lengthy hospital stay turned into a nightmare. Little did we or John's medical team know, but he had 2 bleeding ulcers in his duodenum, and the very harmful blood thinners were causing the ulcers to bleed freely and massively. John was moved from one ICU to a more intense ICU setting. It was while medical folks were getting John situated in the ICU that I heard the horrible words, "Code Blue," and his room was called. Running to his room, I witnessed the violence that a code blue affords. If you've ever seen one, you know what I mean. I was quickly ushered to a family waiting room while all our family and many friends had by that time gathered. Our parish priest, Father George, was allowed to remain in the ICU room to fervently pray during the code blue. 20 minutes later, one of the ICU physicians working the code came in to tell us they could not get John's heart started again and for us to prepare for his death. Unbeknownst to me, our Father George got a strong message at this time from God. God told Father George it was not John's time to go and to instruct the code team to keep going and not stop. They kept going because Father George insisted. Father George told them because God insisted. About 32 minutes and 42 bags of blood later, John's heart responded to their very hard work. He was put on a ventilator, but was still bleeding profusely. An emergency surgery was attempted to try and locate the bleeding source, but it couldn't be done. We were told for a second time that day that John would die at any moment. He didn't. 3 long days later, an adventurous gastroenterologist wanted to try to find the ulcers, as stopping the bleeding was John's only hope for survival. Not only did he find the hidden ulcers, but he cauterized them and the bleeding subsided. 6 days after medically dying and being brought back to life again, John was moved off the ventilator to a BiPAP machine. It was his 74th birthday. What a present for all of us. John still wasn't conscious, but was showing signs that the brain damage he experienced was not massive. 3 very long months later, John walked out of his latest rehabilitation center. While John has had many surgeries and procedures during the last few years, and he lives now with many physical and some cognitive challenges, he's enjoying life and our family, and is a daily reminder of God's promises and love and the power of prayer. Oh, and in case you're wondering, John has absolutely no recollection of that 5 months of his life, and he had no out-of-body experiences and saw no light that we read about often. Clearly, as it was not God's plan for John to transfer to heaven that day. As you can imagine, I asked John to reveal to me what I should learn from these experiences, and his message was clear, and so I share them with you today. Don't overcomplicate this. Miracles happen, and this was a miracle. But the big message to me from God, and it still is the same 5 years later, never think that I don't need you, my children, to help me. I, your God, need you to be my hands, my mind, my heart, my legs. I need you to listen to my still small voice, or my raucous shouting voice when I call or instruct. I, your God, need you to search for my will and to do my will in this world. Forget about let go and let God. I need you to do all my work and to make those everyday miracles happen. Ours is not a passive you receive relationship. It's an active 2-way partnership. So now it's your turn. What shocking, life-changing, or extremely beautiful life experiences has God used to show you miracles or life lessons? What is God telling you today? What can you do to work actively with God to spread his kingdom? What will be your outward and visible sign of an inward and holy grace? What will you do in response? Although personal time of reflection will end, my prayer is that if we can take those reflections, offer them to God during this holy season of Lent, confess our separation from our Lord, and vow anew to lead a refined life together, then my mission will have been done, or rather God's mission. Be aware of new revelations God might be bringing you, such as, remember Dr. Carlos Robinson's great lesson on code switching? Do you use code switching with other people and in different situations? Something to think about and notice. Think about your life, notice your life, explore your life. Ask yourself and ask God to tell you how he wants you to be actively involved. Thank you so much for your time and your honest participation. Many, many blessings.